You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, we've got some really surprising news from Jack Smith here. The federal grand jury in D.C. that indicted Trump last week is now meeting again. So, what does that mean?
It means we're going to have a new indictment soon, I suspect. Remember, in the first indictment that was issued by the grand jury for Donald Trump's attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 election, the first DC indictment, there were six uncharged co-conspirators. What can we glean from that? Those six individuals, Jack Smith is now on record as saying they committed crimes with Donald Trump. They are co-conspirators in Trump's efforts to steal the 2020 election. There's no way that Jack Smith would put that information in a public-facing document, a criminal indictment, and then decline to indict those six criminals. So I suspect he may still be presenting evidence to the grand jury regarding those six co-conspirators, but I have a feeling very soon we will see the second indictment, not necessarily what we call a superseding indictment, but a second separate indictment of those six co-conspirators. And Brian, it could include lots of others. Remember that there were 48 people that were indicted and convicted, either pleaded guilty or went to trial and were found guilty behind the Watergate scandal. And that was a pretty modest criminal scandal as compared to what Donald Trump orchestrated in his efforts to steal an election from the American people. So if we had 48 defendants in Watergate, goodness, we could have 148 defendants in this case.
Right, but Glenn, couldn't that have the unintended consequence of slowing down the entire case against Trump, given that every new defendant leaves more room for delays?
Great question. That's why I said this will be a second separate indictment, not a superseding indictment. If Jack Smith started to return superseding indictments, and that's a term of art in the law, it would mean that every indictment would include Donald Trump, but it would add charges and add defendants. And you're absolutely right. If that is the route pursued by Jack Smith, then every time there was a new indictment handed down by the grand jury that included charges against Donald Trump, it would push the trial date farther and farther down the road. That's not what I'm expecting to see. I'm expecting to see additional indictments, but without Donald Trump being charged in those new indictments, so that the one indictment, the 4-count indictment that Jack Smith has already had the grand jury return against Donald Trump, I suspect will remain unaffected by subsequent additional indictments. And that case, those 4 counts will be on track to go to trial. And I suspect Tanya Chutkin will make it a speedy trial.
So just to be clear now, if we do see indictments, a new indictment for these otherwise unnamed co-conspirators, this would be an entirely separate case. I mean, it would be obviously related to the ongoing case that Trump is facing right now, but it would act as an entirely separate case, right?
Absolutely. And Donald Trump will go to trial as the lone criminal defendant sitting at counsel table, and all of the other defendants who are charged in separate subsequent indictments, they will all go to trial together.
And what do you think any new charges for a new indictment could be based on?
So I have a feeling we're going to see at least these 6 presently unindicted co-conspirators charged for basically the same charges that Jack Smith brought against Donald Trump, because he made clear in that indictment that these 6 co-conspirators committed the crimes that that Donald Trump has been charged with. Why? Because they were all part of the same conspiracy. So we're going to see those charges. But the other thing I suspect we're going to see, we might start seeing some charges for Donald Trump's finance crimes as part of his, his PAC, his fundraising efforts that he told his donors are going for one purpose and they end up going for an entirely different purpose. The open question, the really interesting question is, do we see Donald Trump added into those indictments for financial crimes, for example, in a subsequent case that Jack Smith is not interested in going to trial in anytime soon, because he wants to kind of keep pristine the 4-count indictment that has already been returned against Trump, so that one can remain on the fast track to trial.
Now, is there any likelihood that we might see a charge either for Donald Trump or any new co-conspirators for inciting an insurrection? And also beyond that, like what would be the downside of bringing a charge like that that may be harder to prove than the charges that are already on the table?
That's an important question, because if we think back to what Donald Trump said in his pre-insurrection rally on the Ellipse on January 6th, and what Rudy Giuliani said, and what Don Jr. said, and what Mo Brooks said, they all used dramatically inflammatory language, trying to get everybody whipped up into a frenzy, lying to them about their votes being stolen and their election being rigged. And then in various ways, they said, you know what? You got to go to the Capitol and fight like hell, or you won't have a country anymore. Or Rudy Giuliani said, let's go have trial by combat.
Right.
Or Bo Brooks said something about, blood needs to be shed. I'm taking liberties. I don't remember exactly the inflammatory language he used. Here's the thing. If there is a charge for inciting an insurrection brought, that is actually where there would be a robust argument that some of that might be protected by the First Amendment. The beauty, I use the term loosely, the beauty of no charges being brought for inciting the insurrection that day is Jack Smith has taken away thus far from Donald Trump and anybody else who might have been charged for inciting the insurrection. He's taken away the argument that the charges have anything to do with what is possibly First Amendment protected speech. It really was a conservative call, at least on the legal front, a conservative call by Jack Smith. And I would go so far as to say it was a really smart call, because there can be no defense mounted by Donald Trump that he is being prosecuted because of his speech that might enjoy First Amendment protection.
Right. Maybe not a legal defense, but clearly that isn't stopping him from making that argument in the court of public opinion. I mean, that is the exact argument that he and his allies have trotted out across the conservative media ecosystem, right? That this is all an attack on Donald Trump's First Amendment rights. And I think Jack Smith knew so well in advance that that would be Trump's defense here, which is why he put it on page 2 of a 45-page indictment that says not only can Trump say whatever he wants to say about this, but he can actually go so far as to lie about the results of the election, and all that's protected speech. This indictment is not about that. This indictment is about conspiring to deprive Americans of their right to cast their ballots, conspiring to create this whole scheme to defraud a free and fair election from moving forward and from blocking the certification of the election results. So I think that, to your point, Jack Smith very clearly knew that was going to be Trump's move here, and kind of pulled the rug out from under his feet.
Yeah, let me follow up on that. It's a great point. And I would say it's comical, but there's really nothing funny about what's going on. But it's almost comical that Donald Trump and his defense attorneys are out there, spewing into the public square. His defense attorneys going on all of the Sunday news programs saying Donald Trump's being prosecuted for First Amendment protected speech. It is almost as if the defense attorneys are making arguments against the indictment they expected to see, but not the indictment that Jack Smith had the grand jury return.
Right.
And the other thing, and I just wrote a piece for MSNBC Daily about this that hasn't gone to publication yet. The really unfortunate thing is Donald Trump's defense lawyers, his mouthpieces, are making these absurd arguments about First Amendment protected speech, and they are misleading the public. It very much has the feel of what Donald Trump did in advance of the 2020 election that he knew he would lose. What did he say? He said, oh, it's going to be a rigged election. That's the only way I could lose. And now Donald Trump and his attorneys are throwing so much disinformation, propaganda, and lies into the public square, saying things like, oh, you know what? I can't get a free trial in DC. The jurors hate me. So if I am convicted, it's because it will be a rigged trial. Well, we've heard that before, haven't we? And here we go again. Donald Trump and his lawyers spouting out this nonsense. I will say, Brian, it's really upsetting I think for those of us who practice law in the criminal justice arena, both prosecutors and defense, to see defense attorneys going on the public airwaves and making misleading statements about what's going on, really parroting or mimicking the misinformation, the propaganda, and the outright lies of the client. I hope to heck Judge Tanya Chutkan at some point holds the defense attorney's feet to the fire and says, listen, you will take those dirty tricks that you've been spouting out in the public square, put them back in your trick bag, and do not take them out again.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm not saying that Donald Trump's attorneys are bad, but I will say that when you have a reputation for never paying the people who work for you, you're left with a certain quality person. So we'll just leave it at that. Glenn, what still has to be litigated in pretrial motions, and when do you presume that we'll see a trial date announced for this case, for the election theft case?
I can almost promise you we're going to have a trial date announced on August 28th. The reason I can promise that is because as I attended the arraignment hearing for Donald Trump, the magistrate judge who was presiding over that hearing, it wasn't Judge Chutkan, it was a magistrate judge, said, Judge Chutkan has asked me to direct you, prosecution and defense attorneys, to file a motion with a proposed trial date. And then when you meet at the next status hearing in this case, which was set for August 28th, Judge Chutkan will be setting a trial date. So I'm quite sure Judge Chutkan will be setting a trial date on August 28th. With respect to what needs to be litigated, pretty much everything, right? All pretrial motions that the defense can come up with attacking, for example, the theory of liability. You know, they will make all sorts of claims, largely frivolous claims, baseless claims, claims without any legal support that, you know, the grand jury process was abused and the charges as returned have some legal infirmity. They will argue executive privilege. They will argue anything and everything they can think of, in part just trying to bog down the process. But again, with Judge Chutkan presiding, she is a fair, independent, smart, fearless judge. She has proved that in 10 years on the federal bench. She will move through all this like you know what through a goose, and she will stick with a trial date she sets. But don't be surprised if we see lots of motions filed by Trump's legal team. Some of them may have some merit and require some serious litigation to resolve. Many of them will not.
All right. And finally, Glenn, given the fact that there is only one defendant in this case and we don't have to deal with the issues of declassifying classified documents and whatnot, do you think that there's a world in which this trial could happen early in 2024 as opposed to, you know, something closer to the summer or the fall of 2024?
I believe the case will be tried and resolved sometime in early to perhaps mid 2024. There is absolutely no reason that the defense team can't prepare for a trial that is set 6 months in advance, let's say February 2024. A trial like this will probably take 3 or 4 weeks to try to its conclusion, to try to a verdict. So I would expect we will have this case resolved by perhaps March, maybe April of 2024, which at least will be well in advance of the November 2024 presidential election. So, as we've discussed previously, in the event Donald Trump is the Republican nominee for president, the voters will know whether they're casting their vote for a convicted felon or a completely exonerated defendant who the jury said, you know what, he's done nothing wrong, we've cleared him of all charges. What is the likelihood that will be the result?
Yeah, pretty amazing development that'll be for the party of law and order. But you know, what else can you expect? With that said, for anybody watching, if you want to stay on top of this stuff, especially as we see this case continue to work its way through the court, make sure to subscribe. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen,
and I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.